Ladies and gentlemen, my colleague Alan managed to keep you awake after the lunch. I hope I'll do the same. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, UNHCR is grateful to Sri Lanka Navy and the government of Sri Lanka for the invitation to participate in this year's International Maritime Conference, Gold Dialogue 2016. The scale of internal and international displacement over the last few years has reached unprecedented levels since the unimaginable horrors and suffering of the world community faced during Second World War. Some 65 million people are affected and have been forced to move as a result of the conflict, violence, and human rights abuses. While I'm able to state that fact in one simple sentence, that simple sentence represents 65 million destinies, fearful experiences, daily examples of human and material losses, girls and boys, women and men who have and still are living through the immense deprivation, crime, and persecution as their families, homes, communities, and way of life are falling apart. Mr. Volker Turk, who is UNHCR's Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, has stated the following during the recent Executive Committee meeting, which is the governing body of the UNHCR, that met in October this year. When reflecting on protection developments, he said, I quote, "Reflecting on protection developments over the past year, I must admit the following image, first coined by Antonio Gramsci, has come to mind. The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time for monsters. The monsters in today's world most certainly are horrors and raging conflict, violence and human rights abuses which people flee within or outside their countries year after year, often confined to an existence of displacement with no end in sight, seeing the societies they lived in changed forever." Distinguished delegates, I will share with you some of the key features from UNHCR's analysis of the global forced displacement data, which was available by mid this year. As we look at these disturbing numbers, please do keep in mind the actual human experience behind the numerical signs and challenging protection realities faced by people in different regions of the world. So in June 2016, 65.3 million people were forcibly displaced. This is more than a population of France, the UK, or Italy. Almost 3 times population of Sri Lanka. Some 24 people are displaced every minute. That's faster than an average adult breathes. 1 human in every 113 individuals is affected. For every refugee, there are 2 persons displaced internally, often in conditions of great danger. Forced displacement has doubled in less than 20 years. 9 out of 10 refugees are hosted in poor or middle-income countries. 3 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia, produced half of the refugees under UNHCR care. 8 countries, Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia, Jordan, Kenya, and Uganda, hosted half the refugees under UNHCR care. About half of the world refugees are children. In 2015, almost 100,000 were children alone or separated from their families. Some 10,000 people have died just on the Mediterranean since the beginning of 2014. More than 3,000 individuals in 2015. We also saw a death toll rising as a result of the increased Andaman Sea and Bay of Bengal maritime movements in 2015. Xenophobia and populism are rising. Together with walls and fences, people are being pushed back, fired at and tear-gassed at the borders. While the numbers speak for themselves, seeing more restrictions being put in place, effectively preventing those in need of asylum to access it, the same gentleman, Mr. Volker Turk, our Assistant High Commissioner, said the following, quote, "It is clear against this backdrop that the international protection regime is needed as much now as it was when it was conceived. This legal regime, anchored in multilateralism and developed over decades, is a lifeline for millions and has withstood the test of time. It is the part of the old world which must be preserved in the formulation of the new. As conflict prevention, genuine human rights commitments, and good governance remained wanting. We must bolster the safeguards that were crafted for the individuals who suffer the most. Distinguished delegates, the theme of this year's conference could not have been more timely in the face of such unprecedented challenges. Partnership and collaboration have never been more important. UNHCR is positive that only through forging new and reinforcing existing strategic partnership, the global citizenry would be able to move to a new level as we collectively continue to do more to deliver protection and durable solutions to forcibly displaced. This year's global events have been colored by the theme of cooperation and solidarity, and the recognition that the solution to international humanitarian problems lie in international cooperation. A number of events were organized in this spirit, ranging from conferences on Sustainable Development Agenda, the Paris Climate Agreement, to the May Humanitarian Summit. On September 19, 2016, the United Nations General Assembly held a summit on large movements of refugees and migrants. 193 member states adopted the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, clearly articulating that the global refugee and migration crisis cannot be managed by one country alone, but by a predictable and collaborative international response based on solidarity and responsibility sharing. Reinforcing the significance of refugee protection in adopting the declaration, member states declare profound solidarity with persons who are forced to flee. States reaffirm their obligations to fully respect the human rights of refugees and migrants through adherence to the international legal framework, and they pledge robust support to countries affected by large movement of refugees and migrants, underpinning the notion that responding to refugees was a shared international responsibility. The summit further solicited uncontested agreement that development approaches must be paired more firmly with the humanitarian responses, and in particular to improve education and economic opportunities for refugees and communities in which they live. The growing engagement of the private sector is necessary and indeed is becoming reality. For instance, Mr. George Soros pledged $500 million for companies, startups, and other private sector initiatives by refugees and migrants. The New York Declaration charts a new course for refugee protection in two significant ways. States agreed and tasked UNHCR to develop a comprehensive refugee response framework and the Global Refugee Compact by 2018. This will set out a blueprint for a stronger system with more reliable funding and early engagement of development actors to help those forced to flee their homes and communities which are hosting them. A day after that summit, on the 20th of September, the Leaders' Summit for Refugees, initiated by President Obama, was held, and it offered specific commitments to support refugees and hosting countries, essentially offering concrete pledges that will help operationalize the New York Declaration. In the words of Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner of UNHCR, the New York Declaration fills what has been a perennial gap in the international refugee protection system, that of truly sharing responsibility for refugees in the spirit of UN Charter. This, distinguished delegates, in the eyes of UNHCR, is a clear recognition that stronger partnerships are necessary if we wish to see that the monsters of raging conflict, violence, and human rights abuses do not continue to haunt millions of human beings. They are essential at all levels in the face of ever-growing suffering and violations of rights that forces millions of people to leave their homes and face other deadly risks and perils, such as death at sea or abuse in the hands of the criminal human trafficking rings as they seek to reach safety. UNHCR's governing body, the one I mentioned already, Executive Committee, recognized it in its October conclusion, urging all states and UNHCR to increase their efforts to further strengthen international cooperation and solidarity and equitable responsibility and burden sharing. It is interesting to note that this year's prestigious Nansen Refugee Award was accorded to the Hellenic Rescue Team, a team of more than 2,000 volunteers who saved more than 2,500 lives and assisted more than 7,000 vulnerable people during the rescue operations in Mediterranean, only in 2015. They show us how we all can make a difference as they serve as a heroic example of solidarity and cooperation in the maritime context. Distinguished delegates, let me say a few words about the region. It was last year that UNHCR was invited for the first time to contribute to the work of the Goal Conference. We have spoken then about the regional proposal, developed in partnership with IOM and with UNODC, to create inclusive mechanisms to ensure the safety and rights of asylum seekers and refugees in the context of irregular movements at sea. Governments in the region, confronted with the challenges of mixed migration movements in the Bay of Bengal and Andaman Sea, were invited to consider it while addressing the plight of refugees and asylum seekers. That proposal in its core premised the strategic partnerships and cooperation among states, international organizations, civil society, host communities, and persons of concerns themselves. Last year, UNHCR noted, pardon me, only through collective action can a response be achieved that meets concerns over national security, the orderly management of migration and borders, and the human security of the people affected without creating or exacerbating tensions between the states. And where are we today? The 2015 Bay of Bengal and Andaman Sea had been building for years. Rohingya from Myanmar and Bangladeshis had been traveling in the thousands to Malaysia via Thailand. The discovery of mass graves at smugglers' camps brought attention to the movement. The response by the states was largely ad hoc, with Thailand taking a leading role. The 17 recommendations from the Bangkok special meeting on 29 May 2015 were very good, but unfortunately remain largely unimplemented. Similarly, the recommendations from the emergency meeting of ASEAN ministers responsible for transnational crime in Kuala Lumpur in July 2015 are still to see their full implementation. Among other things, these call for creation of the Trust Fund and the management of the ASEAN Secretariat and the Task Force to guide response. The Trust Fund received several $100,000 that unfortunately remain unspent, and the task force was never created. Since the end of 2015 crisis, the maritime movement has not resumed. Those who have taken the route have advised UNHCR that this is because of stepped-up interdiction, particularly in Bangladesh and Thailand, significantly increased costs for the journey, reflecting the greater risk for smugglers in undertaking it, a greater awareness of perils of the travel from the revelation of the mass graves, and the possibility of frustration of livelihood hopes. It is soon to say whether push factors such as the recent violence in northern Rakhine State will again have Rohingya taking to the sea. If they do, based on one vessel with asylum seekers reaching Indonesian shores this summer, and some pronouncements by the authorities recently in response to rumors of boats of Rohingya approaching, the response risks looking very much like it did during the crisis of May and June 2015. Despite the commitment in recent March 2016 ministerial declaration of Bali process members, no progress has been made on the two key immediate concerns in response to a maritime movement: coordinated search and rescue and predictable places of disembarkation. UNHCR is hopeful that the review of the 2015 crisis currently being undertaken by Bali process members will prompt actions on agreed recommendations. And indeed it did, because in November, a Bali process meeting was held actually here in Colombo, and it adopted the report the review report of the 2015 response, and actually confirmed the creation of the task force and a set of other measures to predictably respond to the possible movements. Another point is that the UN has recently agreed a 5-year plan of action with the ASEAN, and there is a scope within it for increased cooperation on irregular migration. Allow me to spend a couple of minutes on UNHCR's work in Sri Lanka. We have been working for the last 28 years in Sri Lanka, supporting the government in assisting the conflict-induced internally displaced persons, Sri Lankan refugee returnees, and from 2012 onwards, more increasingly non-Sri Lankan refugees. This is a period in which a number of good practices and examples, harnessing partnerships and cooperation among a variety of actors, from government to affected communities, have helped a large number of people to overcome the effects of internal conflict, to re-establish their lives and realize their positive human potential on their path to achieve durable solution. With regards to internal displacement, in August this year, Cabinet of Ministers, Sri Lankan Cabinet of Ministers, approved the National Policy on Durable Solution for Conflict-Affected Displacement. UNHCR and several other UN agencies partnered with the Ministry of Resettlement in Sri Lanka already in 2015 to draft the national policy. The policy, which is funded on rights and community-based approaches, is the blueprint that the government intends to use as it enters into the final stages of support for durable solutions for people displaced by the conflict, including Sri Lankan refugee returnees. Similarly, during the last 2 years, concerted actions by several UN agencies through the UN Peace Building Fund facilitated government's commitment to enable return of internally displaced persons to their home areas and to lands that have been under the purview of the Sri Lankan army. In some instances, yes, please. In some instances, for up to 2 decades. Interventions in shelter, land, housing and property, water and sanitation, education and livelihoods, mine risk education and protection monitoring have enabled several communities in protracted displacement to return home. With regards to Sri Lankan refugee returnees, an estimated 100,000 refugees are still continue to live in Tamil Nadu in India. The recognition of their vulnerability required and that they require government assistance to reintegrate upon return is of great importance. As of today, some 800 individuals have returned during this year through UNHCR facilitation. Although this number is relatively small in absolute terms, it is growing for the 2nd year in a row, and that perspective has prompted the Ministry of Resettlement to establish the National Steering Committee on the refugee returns. With regards to asylum seekers and refugees, although Sri Lanka has been a refugee-producing country for the past few decades, stability, economic growth, and relatively favorable and tolerant environment have changed her into a destination country, or a country of asylum, as we say in UNHCR. We would like to thank government for allowing very necessary protection space for refugees, but we are still looking forward to forge a strategic partnership there in this core area of our mandate responsibility, namely the absence of policy and legal framework governing refugee affairs, given that Sri Lanka is not signatory to the 1951 Convention, hinders the work of institutions and service providers and leaves some of the people in greatest need of international protection without basic rights accorded by the national authorities of the host state. Finally, let me conclude this contribution by UNHCR with the word of His Excellency Mr. Ivancic, Sri Lankan Ambassador to the United Nations, during the Executive Committee session in October this year. He said, "Single country or region is not in a position to overcome such crises successfully without the mutual assistance and cooperation of others. Solutions to address root causes need the continuous support and collaboration of the international community. The common political will of the international community is a must in achieving durable solutions. In this context, the historic summit of the UN General Assembly on addressing large-scale movements of refugees and migrants marked an important milestone to further the engagement by member states, including by developing a global compact for safe, regular and orderly migration and global compact of refugees by year 2018. Sri Lanka fully supports these multilateral efforts to reach productive conclusions with the relevant international legal frameworks and encourages UNHCR to look for practical experiences of countries of origin, transit and destination, and the inherent challenges when developing the proposed comprehensive refugee response framework as stipulated by the New York Declaration. Thank you very much.